Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Femmes du Vin harvest session on fair labor, advocating for equality from vine to glass. My name is Nabilha Rawji. I'm a CMS advanced sommelier based here in Toronto, Ontario, and I'm very excited to be moderating our discussion today with such a powerhouse group of women from around the world. I'll be introducing our panelists in just a short minute or two, but I'd like to cover a few bits of housekeeping first. Our session today is going to be 90 minutes with about 30 minutes reserved at the end for Q&A. Secondly, there is a Q&A box on your screen there, and please use that to drop in any questions that you might have. The Femmes du Vin team will be fielding those on the back end and then passing them over to me to direct to our panelists when we get to our Q&A period. I definitely encourage you to get those questions in as they come up, rather than leaving them to the end where we'll have a flurry of questions. And of course, to all of you wonderful participants, thank you for your attendance and support. You can opt to donate at any time during or after the session, and know that your contributions are supporting the Femmes du Vin Scholarship Fund. You can donate by visiting www.femmesduvin.org. And of course, you can keep the conversation going online by engaging with us on social media. Our hashtags should be just up here on screen in a moment. All right, and it looks like we have quite a wonderful number of people rolling in. I see a whole bunch of participants. Very excited to see the numbers that we have today. So we are going to be looking at fair labor and what that means for the wine industry from grape to glass, considering the whole life cycle of a wine. We will look at how sustainability can be reimagined to take into account workers' rights. And we'll also look at how we can push for labor equity for the people who work in vineyards, who craft wine in cellars, and those who sell and service wine. Our session today is powered by the generous support of Advini South Africa. So really wonderful, absolute thanks to them. And now on to introduce our panelists. First up, we have Charlene Theodore. Charlene is a trailblazing workplace lawyer, the first Black president of the Ontario Bar Association, and the founder of the Black Women's Wine Collective. In September of this year, she was named as one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in Canada by Canadian Lawyer magazine. And there she is joining us on screen. And then we have Emily Wines. Emily Wines is a master sommelier and an all-around hospitality expert. Today, she joins us from her role as the VP of Beverage and Wine Experiences at Cooper's Hawk Winery and Restaurants. And then we have Nabilha Rawji, who's joining us from France, where she's based at the moment. She is an integral part of the Advini team, where she has spearheaded the company's expansion into South Africa. She joins us today as the managing director of Advini South Africa. And then finally, I just want to note that we will not have Elaine Chukan joining us this afternoon. Unfortunately, there were some unforeseen circumstances. However, part of our prep and for this call was to have some pre-discussions over the last couple of days. And Elaine had some really fantastic insights and knowledge to share on the topic of fair labor. And she has given her permission for me to share some of those insights with you all as part of our discussion today. So you'll see me pop in and chime in a couple of times throughout our discussion to make clear note of where Elaine has made some special, has offered some special knowledge up. All right, so let's see. I think we're going to start with fair labor in production, or on the production side of the wine industry. And I just want to make a special note that, of course, we're an event that's focused on women's experiences and women working in the wine industry. And when we say women, we mean all women, inclusive of the entire range of experiences across race, physical ability, gender, identity, and orientation. We want to make sure that everyone understands that this is a space that is inclusive and meant to really include all women who are participating in the wine industry. And then Emily, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. I know that we heard Elaine speak a little bit over the last couple of days about how California in particular, but the US in general, has seen a shift from vineyard workers, really meaning individual migrant workers who are coming up. Now it's shifting more to a space where it's full families. And so what are you seeing in terms of how this plays out in California, and with this shift to really wanting to support not necessarily just individual workers, but full communities?
It really is a full community. We're talking about not just families, but multi-generational who are working this land. Often you have whole communities or families that are connected with a single winery as opposed to kind of working back and forth throughout the region. The challenges that are faced here are pretty complex. A lot of it has to do with education and childcare, also healthcare being a really big one, and also issues of citizenship that also play into some of the access to healthcare and childcare both. And then on top of that, there are some things that have happened in California that have unfairly affected this community. In particular, right now, once again, for the third year in a row, we've had some major fires that have gone through wine country. And this is something that I hear consumers asking a lot, oh, how are the wineries? How are the vineyards? And they certainly have been affected, but by and large, the most painful effect of these fires have been the loss of homes by a lot of these vineyard working communities. And you find a lot of them are homeless, and they're struggling with not just housing insecurity, but food insecurity and ways of taking care of their children while still supporting the wineries and the vineyard.
Sorry, muted there. And then I'm curious, Charlene, if you can chip in with your perspective on how this plays out in the Canadian wine industry, in particular here in Ontario. I know that we really have the seasonal agricultural workers program. Do you see that these workers are benefiting, or the families that they leave behind and are working for, do these families benefit through these programs?
Well, to say that there's no benefit is, I think, is too, it's a more nuanced conversation. So, one of the key issues with our seasonal agricultural worker program is the fact that your program, your employment is linked to one employer. Okay. So for example, if I were to come here to Canada to work at a tech startup, and let's say I'm a woman and it's just, a racist, misogynist environment, and I'm here to work in the tech industry, I can move to another company in the tech industry with fairly little issue, fairly little barriers. But when it comes to agricultural workers, their status is linked to that specific employer. So what that does is it creates a setup for people to, essentially suffer it sets the plate up for those who are not good employers to essentially put that worker in an indentured situation. The other issue is that although these workers do pay into the Canadian social kind of the taxes in our social network and employment insurance, they rarely receive the benefit of those programs. Number one, because primarily they don't have access to things like our Canada Pension Plan. And number two, because again, when your income is linked to one employer and you have a complaint about that employer, it's very difficult for some of these seasonal workers who rely on that income to bring a complaint forward to the proper agencies. And it's also extremely difficult for their coworkers to support them. Where you do find a few cases in the Canadian context are of people who have perhaps met their romantic partners and become married in Canada. And then because they become a citizenship through marriage, they are able to fully take advantage of those things. So there was a seminal case about a agricultural worker from St. Lucia, which ironically is where my parents were from. That's where they immigrated from to Canada. And this person was repeatedly called the N-word by his employer, living under horrible working conditions and also very racist working conditions. And he was able to go to the Human Rights Commission in Ontario and receive an award, but that's the exception to the rule. And we need to have our eyes open to the fact that's not the exception to the rule as far as the worker's experience. One of the main points of discussion right now is because our winemakers in Ontario are so reliant on our foreign workers program, and as I mentioned, they're coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, some from Southeast Asia, is the fact that there is no clear path to citizenship, right? And they are, for the most part, like they're not required to pay anything more than our statutory minimum wage, which is good in Ontario. And so one of the things that I'd encourage people to think about is, rather than comparing the wages that you're paying your foreign workers to what they would have made back home, comparing it to the reality of what workers are valued for in Canada, the same way that you would with any other industry. The things that you need to look at, while some workers have benefited, this is physically taxing work. A lot of them, they have to work until they physically can't work anymore. And there are studies that show that they're not benefiting as much as one would think in terms of raising them out of the level of poverty back home. So even though you're earning more money and sending it back home, it's often not enough to raise their families back home out of the level of poverty, although they may be doing better.
That's something I think maybe a lot of Canadians at least don't realize, because I think if anyone recognizes that maybe it's not exactly the same and you don't enjoy all the benefits of full employment protections as you would as a Canadian, but that they're somehow improving their situation or helping to improve their family's lot. So that's really an impactful thing to hear, that it's not even really quite working out in that way. I did want to make note that part of our pre-call discussion, we came up around with Elaine, the idea that viticultural work as a form of agricultural work is different than other seasonal rotational crops where they go into the ground and are harvested year after year, versus something like grapevines where, one, they are in the ground and need to be in the ground for several years before they're viable for production in a commercial sense, as well as we prize what we get out of old vines and the wonderful fruit and wines that they can create. So I was hoping that maybe a couple of you would like to chip in with why should we as wine drinking consumers care about these vineyard workers, some of whom come back to the same vineyard 15, 20, 30 years in a row and have accumulated this huge wealth of knowledge about how to maintain vines and make vines thrive.
I actually have a specific example from the Ontario context. So in 2014 and 2015, we had even for Canada, which is a very high bar, we had a brutally cold winter. And there's a winery here called Stratus in one of our wine-growing regions in Niagara, and they had a lot of damage, as most wineries did, for some of their grapes. And so what they wanted to do is to do something with the destroyed, produce, and turn it into a form of charcoal known as biochar. And even though the winemakers had more than 40 years of winemaking experience between them, they weren't sure how to tackle this project. And they relied on one of their seasonal workers from Jamaica to lead the project, because he did have that specialized experience that he had actually gained back home in Jamaica on a friend's farm. So again, it's not that we are just using the we're not using them just for the physical labor. The seasonal workers are not just bringing physical labor, they're bringing specialized knowledge and skills that, quite frankly, we don't necessarily have, right? And so that's a technique with the biochar that Stratus ended up putting into regular production. And so again, if you compare that maybe to the tech industry, medical industry, marketing industry, again, we're not just bringing this group of workers here to physically just pick grapes, haul large bags of things. They actually come with a specialized skill set, and they should be treated as such. And anyone that's devoting, over a quarter of a century, because a lot of them work 30 years plus in this program, to a section of the Canadian economy that we all benefit from. I don't know what the dollar figure is, but it's, we are known for, in Ontario and BC, our wine tourism, just in terms of the ethos of our country and how we reward people for their labor. We should be kind of rethinking how the labor relationship between our wineries in Canada and the workers that actually produce those wines.
Thank you. That's a great example. Naritha, would you be able to touch on maybe what vineyard worker retention and mobility looks like in South Africa? Maybe has there been any positive shifts that way for folks who would have been working vineyards pre-apartheid to post, when it became possible to be more involved and that was all opened up?
Yes, certainly. So just out of an interesting point of view, the context is very different in South Africa. We have, a majority of permanent employees and people that look after the vineyard. I mean, if I speak about Lavenir, we have our vineyard team that's been on, I would say, a set of 35 hectares for more than 35 years now. So the skill set is immense, and for us it is more important to make sure that that skill set is transmitted and taught to a younger generation. So our challenge is, how do you make the new and the younger generation love this industry of winemaking, of viticulture, if there is a stigma connected to it? That used to say, my parents didn't have any other opportunity, so this is what they do. So we are trying to make the young generation, and again, we get coming back to education, because change will only come through education and through the youth, and to bring them back to understand that their parents do have skill sets, to understand that they can also love this industry, and that they don't have to be what their fathers and mothers do, but they will be, that there could be other opportunities for them in life. But the most important challenge for us is to get a new generation that will, that we can transmit the skill set to. So that's the first point. The second point, of course, we have seasonal workers as well, because we handpick everything in South Africa. So the biggest reason for that is to create job creation. And so we have seasonal workers that come every year, but that are mostly South African. So, and very much based in the Western Cape. So it's a little bit different. There's not so much migration force. Even your seasonal skill set is extremely high, because it's people that come again and again, and often specialize in the wine industry. So yes. Then, of course, we can go further in terms of ownership. The WITA is very important for ethical, trade as well. To check that fair labor practices are actioned and actually adhered to, health and safety. All those things were put in place post-apartheid. But these are things that I want to bounce off on what Emily said earlier. Because in South Africa, the challenge is not organic or what it's really sustainability in a much larger form. Is, do you actually look after your people first, and then you start to think about other things. So yes, of course, organic and any way that you work in a sustainable way is important. But in the South African context, the human part is even more important than any of the other examples that I see worldwide. And that for me is in less than 25 years. I mean, we've been making wine for more than 300 years in South Africa. So it's a new world, but not really new world. It's a little bit more old world, 300 years of winemaking. But at the same time, the last 25 years, the evolution has been incredible in terms of the quality of the wine, but also the way that the equality or the labor has been treated in South Africa. Now, I'm not saying that it's perfect, far from that, but there's a absolute willingness to drive that and make it a industry where people have access to health services, housing, because you must also remember in the South African context, a lot of our permanent workers live on the farms. So that's housing, electricity, water, so it's communities. We have communities on our wine estates. So it's not just a business, it's really families. And that's why it's also a bit of an emotional industry, because you have your farm worker families, their families, but they're also part of our families. And then, of course, we can talk about BBEE now, which is a different whole set of different, and we can speak hours about that. And of course, there is still room for improvement, because the wine industry probably still has some work to do in that way. But we have to start somewhere, and we did. And we've made a lot of good progress in less than 20 years. So very important to note that it's a lot of farm, the community that takes care of the farm community, and very much NGOs as well. and also donations from around the world. And this is how it's managed. It's not like there's incredibly huge systems that are put in place to help the South Africans. So it's really taking things in our own hands and making sure that change happens. But again, I'm really very much an advocate that change will come through the youth, and it's the young people and the way that we handle them, expose them, and explain to them what opportunity in the future lies for them in the wine industry, and that's where the change will come. And we can see change because I've been now working with on this type of project since 2008, and we are starting to set our children from the farm working communities through university now. So it's a long process. It's a process, and we must all understand that it's a process, and everyone has the intention to do the best possible, for the people. But again, when I think of South Africa, I think vineyards, because the quality in the glass is important. But I think the people play, the whole obsession with people, and it should be like that, is a huge thing, and emotion. And with quality and the people, and you create emotion, and that's what we have at the end of the day in our glass. And that's also one of the reasons why I believe that South African wine has made so much progress out of a quality point of view in the last 25 years, because people that actually work in it now actually feel also proud of it and has ownership in the process.
That's a wonderful example to show of how fair trade applications and government initiatives can really work together to affect impactful change in really what is a short number of years from post-apartheid. Emily, from a hospitality and sales perspective, how can we as SOMs, as salespeople, the matchmakers between consumers and wineries, how can we support or bring down the stories that really exist behind the scenes that are currently left out?
Well, again, I mean, as sommeliers or sales people, we're really the spokesperson for these wineries, and that enthusiasm for those stories is infectious. And whether it be in situations where we're putting wines on wine lists, or we're selling wines out in the market or to consumers, again, it's really about amplifying those stories.
Awesome. And then I'm just going to go ahead and shift us just a little bit. We're going to start looking at the front of house side, if you will. Let's take a look at sales, distribution, and hospitality. And I'm actually going to put it back to you, Emily. Would you be able to share what you see are the most pressing challenges when you consider fair labor within this sector of the wine industry?
I mean, this was an interesting one to think about, because there's so many places we could go with this discussion. But one that's really stood out to me is this issue in restaurants around tipping. And I live in the Bay Area. There's been a big move towards these no tipping restaurants, and it's been a challenge. And I just recently came across an article in Grub Street where they said, the era of no tipping restaurants is officially done. Danny Meyer, who was one of the early champions of this idea, said, we've come to believe that it's the inability to share tips that's the problem, not the tips themselves. And in fact, tips really are the problem. Tipping itself it's rooted in racialized exploitation. And at its core, it's not just racist, it's also sexist, and it's degrading. Tipping emerged in this era following emancipation, and it really came out as a way to exploit a vulnerable population, particularly Black women, former slaves, and immigrants. And by the early 1900s, a lot of employers saw this as an opportunity to avoid paying wages by encouraging tipping instead of paying people. And you really see this stand out in hotels, and that you still see it today. Who do you tip in a hotel? It's the maid, it's the person who carries your bag, it's the person who opens the door for you, but it's not the front desk, where you see positions that were largely held by white people, especially white men. Tipping also allows businesses to offload the burden of paying workers a fair wage to the customers, who we know are sometimes motivated by their own implicit biases. And tipping really encourages worker exploitation. Restaurant workers in the United States were excluded from the country's first national minimum wage laws until the mid-1960s, when the first sub-minimum wage, which is now called the tipped minimum, was established. And the tipped minimum wage right now, it's $2.13 an hour federally, and that goes across 43 states, making those workers rely on tips. And the bigger problem, though, is the way that tipping really widens the opportunity gap between white and non-white servers, and it really amplifies this racial inequality. So median hourly tips are much higher for white servers over Latinx, Black, and Asian ones. And according to a study that was done at Cornell University, some diners let race and gender and attractiveness impact how they pay their servers. More insidious, diners of all races tend to give higher tips to white servers and lower ones to Black ones. So there was a report published by One Fair Wage recently that said that nearly $5 per hour differential was which includes tips, was found between Black women and white men, and that was nearly $8 an hour differential in New York City alone. And it's not really just about the bias in tipping; it's about the kinds of jobs that people have. People of color make up 47% of tip positions within casual dining restaurants, and only 32% of higher tip positions within fine dining establishments. On the other side, women make up 62% of tipped casual dining jobs, but only 33% of those high tip positions within fine dining. So there's an overconcentration of people of color and women in these lower paying segments and positions, and that most strongly impacts women of color. And then beyond making less, they actually work harder. So data from 538 shows that workers in casual dining restaurants have to work 9 times harder than their counterparts in fine dining to reach the same minimum standard of wage. So that means that they're turning 4 tables an hour versus 0.2. And then you go deeper into it with the inequity between the front and back of the house. So positions throughout the front and back of the house are really highly segregated by both race and ethnicity. People of color are concentrated in the less visible lower wage jobs. They're also much more likely to be employed in the back of the house, in the kitchen, in non-tip positions or low tip positions like busser or runner, rather than as a server or bartender. And on top of that, they often find it difficult to rise in the ranks to better paid tip positions. And in part, this is due to implicit bias. So as far as tipping goes, in the Bay Area, it really has stood out in a big way. Waiters at a full-service restaurant in San Francisco can easily clear $100,000 a year. A mid-level line cook in those same restaurants, even in high-end kitchens, are unlikely to make more than $35,000 a year, which in the very expensive Bay Area is not a living wage. And don't forget that these are also people who have probably paid about $40,000 a year for culinary school. So what we're seeing the restaurants faced with is the shortage of talented cooks. They straight up cannot live in the city they work in. And, for restaurateurs, it was really a quandary. The solution, of course, is to pay cooks more in an industry and in a city that already runs on really razor-thin margins. But raising the minimum wage isn't the answer here. Tipping creates a 2-class system in restaurants. And while minimum wage increases are great, the person who benefits the most is the ones who are already making 3 times that of somebody in the back of the house. So in San Francisco, we don't have a tipped minimum wage. So you've got servers that are making $15 an hour. So then the exponential amount that a restaurateur then has to pay back of the house in order to make it equitable is really prohibitive. But you can't legally require the front of the house to share tips with the back of the house. The Trump administration has proposed legalizing tip pools. And what that does in effect is transfers the ownership of tips from servers to employers. And they could then redistribute those tips as they see fit, which of course opens the door to wage theft. It gives restaurant owners the legal opportunity to keep tip revenue rather than redistribute it. And according to the Department of Labor, the food service industry is one of the biggest violators of wage and labor laws. The industry currently owes over $39 million in back wages, and that's overtime, undistributed tips, withheld paychecks, et cetera. So you can kind of see where this move to tip-free restaurants, where it came from. It's really about saving the hospitality industry by eradicating the pay disparity between the front and back of the house and remove the customer's ability to directly impact what a server makes on any given night. And it's been really painful. Danny Meyer lost 40% of his front of house staff immediately after implementing this idea. A lot of front of house servers didn't want to have their income messed with. The other challenge is that by eliminating the tips and adding that into the price of the check, you have consumers who could intellectualize the idea of raised food prices, but they really couldn't stomach the higher markups on wine and alcohol. And that's really where you saw the dollars being spent going down. And then the other really big challenge is, of course, now you've got raised prices, and higher prices are not higher sales. So you've got restaurants that are now paying a higher tax rate, higher credit card fees, and rents that are based on top line revenue that, again, isn't really revenue. So very sadly, the Union Square Hospitality Group is now quietly eliminating that practice. They're going to a model of revenue sharing with the back of house. Don't know what that looks like. But I think that this experiment isn't over. Really, until tipping is removed from restaurants, it cannot be successful or equitable for all workers in the restaurants. It's really important that the front and back of the house be paid fairly.
Thank you for such a thorough and well-researched take on a topic that is really challenging and large and has a lot of nuance. And I think it's really valuable and important that you noted that it's not just a straightforward, simple answer of just raise the minimum wage for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is something that is demanding a lot of innovation of the restaurant industry and hospitality industry. Charlene, from your perspective in the legal world, what are some of the factors that you think are key in how companies can successfully address fair labor and equity in the workplace?
Sure. So maybe I will talk a little bit about what I do to give you some context. What the legal world means to me. And so I started out my career in international commercial law, actually, and then moved to human rights law, and then moved to workplace law. And so I have practiced workplace law on both sides. So I work for unions, and I also do some work for management. And obviously the management I work for are people who are open to unions or progressive work environments where you have win-win for management and employees. And so the tools and the advice that I give through my company, Theodore Advisory Partners, they come based in a foundation of workplace law, globally, but also what we really do is we talk about change management, which is really what it is, and change management with an equity and intersectional lens. And what I'll say now is one of the reasons why this talk we're having today is so important is we're really coming off a summer where globally there's been a reckoning and a recognition of inequality in general, and anti-Black racism specifically. We're also in the midst of a pandemic, and so no matter what industry you're in, people are really reimagining their workplaces. And so now that we're at that intersection, it really is the perfect time when we've learned these lessons from this protest this summer, and quite frankly, the ongoing protests throughout the world. And we're all forced to really reimagine how we work together to really start fresh and re-innovate and do things a little bit better than we did, pre-COVID. So generally, some of the key elements that you want to look at if you want to undertake kind of the strategic workplace change to having a more equitable, sustainable, and still productive workplace is you need to set a goal. And that may sound simple, but you'd be surprised at how many people just don't start with setting a specific goal. And so the question I usually ask is, where do you want to move the dial? Sometimes it's specific to their community. Some people are concerned with Black, Indigenous, and women of color generally. Some people specifically want to focus on women of color from the LGBTQ perspective. Some people want to really have an impact on Indigenous people in the industry. So I think it's important to pick a goal and decide where your focus is going to be. From the influence change perspective, what you normally find in organizations, no matter what industry you're in, whether it's law, whether it's wine, whether it's medicine, if you have racialized workers in your organization, they will generally be called upon to do that labor. To give their opinions about how to make the workplace more equitable. And while it's important to hear the voices of the people that you work with, if you're working in wine, you may be speaking with perhaps a Black female that works in legal, perhaps a Black female that works in marketing or promotions or events. I think it's important for you as a management team who really has the power to make the strategic decisions to actually go to a third party who actually is trained in change management, because you need to have that balance of listen to the voices of your people, but also not putting the entire burden on organizational change to people who actually aren't on your management team. You wouldn't do that with any other project. If you were undertaking, a governance review, you wouldn't just reach out to your staff to do it. It's something that needs to sit at the management table, whether it's you hire a team in-house or you go to somebody third party to consult. I think before you go on your journey, especially for bigger wine companies that have a governing body, they may have to answer to shareholders. It is important to get that training on implicit bias, so you're not setting yourself set up for failure. The training, I think, is necessary for your governing body, your board, so you are all working towards the same goal, and you understand that you may be going into it with implicit bias. And once you do that, I mean, maybe I'm talking myself out of consulting work, but it really is a lot like the work that these companies already do. If you want to launch your wine in a new region, it's part of a strategic plan. There are staff assigned to it, the appropriate staff with the skills and background to get you there. There are line items in the budget and people are constantly checking in. It is project managed. I think people tend to really, really think that because some of these conversations can be uncomfortable, they think that they have no skill set to do this work, right? But I think you need to find a middle ground between saying, I may not know the lived experiences of the people that I'm trying to influence and maybe create a pipeline to provide more jobs to in my industry, but I do have the skills to take an initiative and make it successful. And where I have those gaps in my knowledge, I'm going to call on other people to help our company grow. And in terms of as far as like picking your group and your goal, there are lots of ways that you can have an impact on the communities that you serve. So speaking specifically of Black, Indigenous women of color, depending on the nature of your company, you may want to start if you're in an area where there is absolutely a dearth, like no women in the industry at all, you may want to look outside of your company and the fact that you're a big player in the industry and go to your wine education institutions and say, look, we want to support a scholarship, connect with the education institutions and the learning institutions to do some outreach. Again, it sounds simple, but I haven't seen a wine producing region yet that doesn't have some sort of group or collective for Black women in wine or people of color in wine. You want to make connections with those groups respectfully and hear their input, hear what their community needs are. And again, if you are working in a wine growing region where there are lots of people of color and you want to create a pipeline to diversify your own workforce, the steps are kind of the same. Again, you want to be able to perhaps create internship opportunities, take another look again through whatever diversity staff that you have, take another look at your HR and interviewing policies, and reimagine how you're doing that work. There are lots of examples of companies. So for example, I think the most popular one is the opera company that started doing blind auditions, and their diversity of their hiring went up by a significant number once they took that form of implicit bias out of it. There are also ways that you can support people from the Black, Indigenous, and queer community by supporting their own initiatives. And so if they are having, if they're having an event, if they're having a launch, you can partner with them. There are things like career incubators. There are a ton of options, but speaking generally, it's about setting a goal, making sure the responsibility for that goal rests within the management team, providing appropriate training for your governance staff, and making sure that you have the community connections and the actual staff or third-party consultants on board to really help you reach that goal. One of the great things is that this can apply to the bigger names in wine because they do have the money and the resources. It's really about priorities. And even small winemakers can come together and form collectives. You know, if you live in a region, or if the commonality is you specialize in the same grape, you know, if you're all cool climate Chardonnay growers, if there's a common interest in being able to support communities of color in your area, even if you don't have the deep pockets, coming together as a collective for the purpose of diversity can be very successful, and the steps are very much the same.
Sorry, still muted there. Thank you for that, Charlene.
You're welcome.
A bit about how can we start thinking about these types of efforts into addressing the current issues facing women in our industry, especially amongst the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to turn the question to Naritha first, just because I know that South Africa had a uniquely challenging time with this because there was a blanket prohibition on wine and alcohol sales for a while. How were women in your industry impacted?
Yes, so first of all, the wine tourism industry is one of the reasons why the South African wine industry has the opportunity to provide so much employment in the Western Cape. So they really do go hand in hand. So the prohibition, meaning really like in the 1930s in the States, we were not allowed to sell a bottle of wine or any alcohol, but I mean, wine's classified as alcohol. So this means a twofold problem. Number one, the product is not moving, but we are farming. So you keep on having your expenses, but you actually have no money coming in. And South Africans, we sell a lot in South Africa. We export, of course, but a lot of our products, especially the smaller wine farmers, that we actually sell in South Africa because we have such a wonderful hospitality industry in the Western Cape built around the wine industry, but also in the rest of the country. So it has been devastating, absolutely devastating. And first of all, the road to recovery will be extremely long. It's not a question of switch off, switch on, switch off, switch on again. It's really, the damage is done. So first of all, with that, absolutely no tourism because the country's borders are closed and still is. South Africa has been in lockdown since the end of March and it's still going. It's starting to open now, but you know, it's a very long road. So that's the first point. But even pre-COVID and going forward, we will have to really use a lot of different way of thinking because we can't think the way we used to think. It's not switching on again. We have to think differently. And we have to stick together, definitely as an industry, and we will have to find new ways of being to recover. But this really gives a lot of opportunities, and it was already the case for women in wine to build a career in the front of house and in the wine industry, but linked to the wine industry, the hospitality industry. And I just give a small example. Advini is a small wine estate, but we have a lodge and a restaurant and a cellar door on the estate, and it's all led by women. And these are women that started at Advini in 2005 in the housekeeping team, you know, back at, you know, not in front of house. And by the infectious smiles and the love for wine and they've all done, we've developed them out of a, we have not developed it as a company. I mean, we've seen the potential and the growth potential. And so we've helped them to actually move to front to house. And they are the lodge and the cellar door is led by Mother Elaine and Elmarie today. And they started at Advini in 2005. So just another example. But for women in the hospitality industry, there's really a lot of opportunities in the South African context. Our challenge now is how we're going to manage the post or the ongoing COVID and then the post-COVID. Because the South African wine industry and hospitality linked I mean, it's almost 1 million job losses, overnight. So yes, it will be extremely challenging. And one of the initiatives that we took is we spoke to our partners and our importers around the globe, and we ran a campaign called Drink South African. Because we could get our wine exported. So just to create awareness that every bottle that you drink out of South Africa, you actually contribute to the wine industry, but also to somebody's job. So those are small campaigns that we do and that we will keep on doing. But the biggest challenge is how do we get our wine industry, and especially the tourism industry around wine, the onotourisme as we call it, back on track. And frankly, I don't have the answer. I just know that it will take us a very long time to recover, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. Emily, I think that we're seeing in general across industries a number of women being forced out of the workplace during the COVID pandemic. Can you speak a bit to how you're seeing this play out for women who work in hospitality, and if there's anything that you see as either a pressing concern or a positive in trying to address these concerns?
I think the biggest challenge is it comes down to childcare for a lot of women, and I think that's continues to be a problem, but especially now. I don't necessarily see women being pushed out of hospitality any more than a lot of people in general just losing their jobs. Salespeople, sommeliers. There are not a lot of sommeliers with jobs currently, and that has been pretty devastating. And it's really those who are able to cross over into other positions within the restaurant who have managed to still bring in a paycheck. It has been definitely challenging.
Absolutely, thank you. We have. I think.
Sorry. If I just may, because Elaine made me think about it. One of the things that we also did in the wine industry in South Africa is to really link to People's Project or other similar projects to make sure that the workforce and the farming community are nourished and safe during these uncertain times. So, for example, I'm talking about basic things like handing out food parcels. So we've now handed, when I say we, Advini South Africa with Pebbles and even Pebbles alone have handed out more than 50,000 food parcels to make sure that people are nourished. I mean, that is how far back to basic. So like Emily was saying, it's not just about being moved out of the workforce. You lose your job, but then we're back to basic needs. And our responsibility, and if we could just cover and make sure that there's safety, protection, and food, I would say that's already a victory in itself.
Absolutely. And I mean, speaking of that, absolutely, restaurants were in the business of feeding people. And I think that one thing that we've seen really well done is that throughout this, restaurant folk have come together and they figured out how to feed each other. And I think that there's been a pretty vibrant movement, at least that I can speak to in Toronto, for making sure that, we do the best as a community, make sure people are not going without food. There's a gentleman, Paul Taylor, who deals with food security issues in general in the city. And it was really fantastic to see some of that work dovetail with what hospitality was doing behind the scenes and vice versa. We have just a couple minutes here, and I think we have a fair number of questions coming in. So I'm actually going to go ahead and say that we turn over to a question and answer period so we can get to as many people's questions as possible. Just bear with me for 1 sec. I'm going to open up that Q&A window there that I've got. All righty. So first one here, kind of on the same topic that we're at. And this is just addressed to the panel in general. We have, in respect to being a woman and the bias we face, do our panelists have any insight regarding women in hospitality having to make a decision to continue their career or to take care of their children with COVID still being a major concern at this point?
Well, I think there's something else to discuss around that, particularly around childcare and around maternity, is that when it comes to sommeliers, it's really challenging. And there are some great women out there who have managed to balance that. But you see it across the board where women who have children, instantly it's thought, well, their priorities are probably different. Their priorities are focused on their children and not so much on their job, whereas men in the same positions are respected. And it's like, oh, well, now he's got a family to take care of. And so he's viewed as more stable and potentially having more commitment to his job than he would be otherwise. And the fact that that is not considered to be an equal playing field is really a big challenge. COVID or no.
So for COVID specific related advice, I think what we're seeing globally is a regression of women's advancements in the workforce, even though we've only been in this for about a month. For the Canadian context, and this will apply depending on the circumstances of your country, what the real issue is, and again, I'll kind of just re-emphasize why it's so important to have these conversations, because we're talking to women around the world here that are kind of facing the same issues. And so in the Canadian context, what's happening is, depending on where you live and what your COVID numbers are, it's on one hand, yes, about childcare, but it's on the other hand about kids being back in school. And so not all parents are able to put their kids back in school physically. So a lot of people are doing online education. And again, no matter what industry you're in, that's a burden that primarily women are facing when their kids are in school. Quite frankly, if your kids are in school online, you're not just leaving them sitting in front of the computer. They're there and they still demand, there are still limits to online education. So some of it is about childcare, and a lot of it is about, like, are your kids physically at home with you and are you participating in their schooling? From a practical perspective, depending on where you live, a friend of mine, I'll give you an example. He's actually a chief officer of medical health for one of the counties in Ontario, and they live on a cul-de-sac. And so they formed kind of a parents collective just with that group, and they all undertook to, like, we're going to limit who we see so our kids can play together. We can have parents watch the kids. So one parent, if she's got a Zoom call, I know a lot of lawyers women lawyers who have trials on Zoom, and then, a kid busts in. And so they've, again, where you can, and again, he lives in a more rural area, they were able to do that. And so I think in terms of support and outreach, where there are job opportunities, to be able to tackle, like, that kind of big barrier of childcare, I think it's important to reach out to women in every industry that you have a common thread, because I'm telling you, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a doctor, whether you work in wine, even if you're an essential worker, women are having a hard time getting work and being able to even take the opportunities that they're given because of the lockdown, right? And again, another reminder, this is something that you may want to start thinking about now. And if you can hear the construction noise behind me, I'm so sorry. This is, 2020 is the year of Zoom. Somebody decided to drill something apparently directly above my head, so bear with me. But what we have to remember is we have yet to, depending on where school term starts where you are, this is our first experience since COVID-19 happened where we've got people trying to navigate kids in school. Yes, it came kind of at the end of the school year for us last year, and we haven't gone through a winter yet. Right. And so we don't know what that's going to look like. So now's really the time to think about the other women in your community, again, no matter what field they live in and who have children, and really start drawing on each other for support, forming support groups, thinking about whether or not childcare is possible to safely execute if you have kind of what we call them as like learning pods or childcare pods. Now's the time to start thinking about that and really preparing for winter, and start, again, this is not necessarily affecting women just in wine. And I would again encourage, in terms of job support, being able to take the opportunities where they come, reach out to women inside and out of your sector, because, we're all, I don't have kids, but we're all, they're all struggling in that sense. And I think it's really important before winter gets here to form community support among women.
100%. All right. And then the next question we have is, how can we as wine consumers, whether we are here in Ontario or California or elsewhere in the world, how do we advocate for better labor practices in the vineyard? I'll leave that. Does anyone in particular want to take that one?
I'll talk about Canada. In the Canadian context, it is it's not as straightforward because it's unlike what's happening in South Africa, where there's a specific organization that deals with wineries. When it comes to health and safety and immigration and the worker program, what you're really doing is you are looking at advocacy at the federal level and advocating for better policies. As a lawyer who has a background in public policy, that is something that I know how to do. But what I would, if you are an existing wine organization and wants to advocate for better policies, I think and you don't have a team of lawyers, I think the best thing to do is make connections with your local community groups and NGOs that advocate for migrant workers in general. We are, strong. The more people there are, the stronger you are. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are some commonalities there. Again, they're not row crops. These are specialized skills that our foreign workers bring to these industries. But there are people out there in the Canadian context that are already doing this work. I think, again, drawing on the first question about some of the drawbacks of romanticizing the wine industry, I think one of your first steps is to form communities with the advocates that are already out there doing the work for agricultural workers in general.
Could you name who you're aware of in the Canadian context, Charlene? Or
I knew you were going to ask me that. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second.
I'm aware of Alicia, and I'm aware of Migrant Workers Alliance. Do you know if there's any others that are on your radar?
I think there may be one specifically for Black agricultural workers, but I'm just going to look it up. Migrant Workers Alliance was the one I was trying to think of, but the drilling in my head was just throwing me. I'll look it up. Look it up.
Naritha, it looked like you might have something to chip in on the same question.
No. I just want to very short. We've the South African wine industry has tried to make it quite simple for the consumer and even for our wine buyers around the globe. So there are two things that you need to look for as the integrity and sustainable seal. You will see it's a seal, a sticker on the neck of the bottle of all wines that come out of South Africa. And at the same time, also look if the wine is certified WITA, which is the ethical certification, and it's an independent body, and the wine farms and the whole community is audited. So it's an absolute transparent body. So if a wine is certified WITA, you know that there are labor, health, and safety practices in place that are world class. Okay, so that is one thing. And then, of course, fair trade as well. Now, fair trade, support fair trade wines, WITA wines, and then sustainable integrity wines. And you will see the seal on every neck of every bottle that comes out of South Africa.
Amazing. And with the WITA certification, is that something that would live on the back label, or is that like a neckband? Sorry, that's on the back.
Absolutely. There's different ways of applying it. It can either be a sticker or integrated, the logo integrated on the back label. So you just have to turn the bottle and you will see WITA certified. It's a proper certification, like I said, with audit, so you can feel safe. And as soon as you that will do two things. Number one, you will support these initiatives. And the provenance of where it's coming from, and what the philosophy behind it is, and at the same time it will encourage those that are not involved yet, which is very important. Because if you imagine if we really put a focus on that that type of effort that a lot of wineries do in South Africa, but not all of them yet, but if it becomes a requirement. Almost what I say, not specifically just WITA, but a requirement to be équitable. I was going to speak French. Then that will also push our wine industry in the right direction. But we've done a lot of good headway. But also the question is now, how do we communicate it so that there's a bit of a pool also? If you see, we can push, but we also need a pool. And the more wine that we sell with that philosophy, the better the wine industry will be, and the more better the people will be treated, and the quality of the wine as well. It's a circle, It's absolutely, everything is connected. It's a chain.
And I just put a link to Kairos Canada. They have some of the organizations, they have links to them that they mentioned already, along with some links to resources, including Know Your Right at Work, farm workers, migrant workers, and some issues with regards to policy change. If you are part of an NGO or community organization that deals with migrant workers, and you are looking to connect with lawyers, the Canadian Hispanic Bar Association is a great resource. Also, the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, of which I'm a former director of, is also a good resource to find a lawyer from that community.
Awesome. Emily, could you provide any insight from the American context for groups that are working around the area of workers' rights and vineyards or advocacy in that way?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest ones is probably the Napa Valley Farm Workers Foundation. And they do quite a bit to promote vineyard workers through education and professional development. Yeah, that I think by far is the biggest.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that kind of takes care of, we had another question specifically for organizations that monitor or safe work efforts or vineyard workers' rights. And then we also have, are there organizations in North America that work with BIPOC people in wine? I can probably take that one. There are quite a few that have cropped up in the States in the last 6 months or so. I'm almost certainly going to forget one or two, so we'll try to get some more resources out to you guys through social media, but certainly you have Julia Coney, who founded blackwineprofessionals.com. You have their counterpart in the UK, bameprofessionals.org.uk, I think. You'll have to look that up, but in the UK, the acronym that is used in place of BIPOC is BAME. In the US as well, you have Tahira Habibi's the Hugh Society, which is opening up other localized chapters and getting people engaged in different regionalities. You have the Roots Fund, which is a partnership effort started, I think, between her, Carlton McCoy, and a few other individuals that is focused on providing scholarship and mentorship, job placement. You have The Way We Wine, which is not necessarily specifically focused on BIPOC individuals per se, but it is about democratizing and making education and resources very accessible and in plain language, which is a really key part of any effort to diversify the ranks of wine. Here in Canada, there is Vinica, which is based on the West Coast, founded by an Okanagan winemaker, Karnail Singh Sidhu, who is based Okanagan, I believe Kalala Wines, together with a few other individuals. They're focusing on agri-diversity, bursaries and scholarships, tasting, training for wine professionals. You have, full disclosure, Vinequity, which is a group that I founded along with 6 other BIWOC women in the Ontario-based wine industry. We do a bit of just matchmaking, helping people find each other. We do scholarships. And of course, you also have the Femmes du Vin Inclusivity Scholarship Fund, to which your donations are going towards and some of your attendance fees for these events. So you have lots of options for support, lots of options for contributing to making positive change for BIPOC individuals that are either on the fringes or already within our industry. And if anybody has any other resources I've forgotten, please just pop them into the Q&A, because there really are an abundance of options. There's a lot of people coming to attend to this issue. And then I'll just move.
Unify is another one. Wine Unify is doing some really cool stuff too. Yeah.
Absolutely, I completely blanked. Yes, I know Anna Christina. And then we do have a couple other questions here for Naritha. Could you expand upon the challenge posed to wineries by a call for a living wage versus a minimum wage in South Africa? Is the minimum wage now, is the new minimum wage 18 Rand an hour for farm workers seen as a maximum wage? And we've got a bit more here. It says, would any wine estate pay more? Is there space for an oversight body for South Africa agricultural workers?
Okay, so maybe just start a minimum wage is a minimum wage, and it's legal by, so yes, of course you can pay more. And the minimum wage also depends on which appellation you are. It depends what type of vineyard you are working with, what the work. I almost want to say the labor that is required to work those specific vines, and also very important is also the people that are working. How long have they been at the winery? What are their skill set? There's a grading system, even for our workers in the fields. So it's not just a minimum wage. It's really like a protection. That's what it's called. Then living wage, I like the word, I very much do, because if you look at living wage, it completely it's for me, my interpretation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it means all the other things that you add. And also there's so many wineries that provides electricity, housing, food, health services, and all these things are on top. It's not included in a minimum wage. So these are all, I want to say, services that wineries put in place for their people, so that the cash that they earn are in the pocket. So I very much would like to emphasize the fact that a minimum wage is a minimum wage, but that you can pay much more depending on where you are situated and what your situation at your winery is. And I know that in Stellenbosch, in the Stellenbosch appellation, where most of our wineries are, which is the most, I would say, well-established and renowned appellation, I can guarantee that that's not where we are lying in terms of wages. But So yes. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, the second part of their question really is speaking to what is the real situation for mobility for industry workers in South Africa to advance themselves, and are people really locked in? If you're a vineyard working family, do you actually have the real option for your children to go off and pursue other avenues of study, university, work? Can parents working in vineyards actually afford to send their children on to pursue other types of industry?
That is a very important part of what we are doing, because there was a stage where you were stuck. If your father was in the wine industry, you were going to be in the wine industry too. That has since changed, because the children have schooling like any other children in any other industry. And then, of course, our biggest challenge was to recreate the love for the industry, because we saw some sort of a brain drain. Like no one wanted to work in the wine industry anymore, because they saw it as more than a suffering than anything else, because of certain practices. And I mean, let's call a spade, but I mean, pre-apartheid, there were certain practices in the wine industry that, of course, the children never wanted to, never had a desire to work in this industry. So in the last 25 years, of course, we're opening up. And how do we do that? With organizations like the Pebbles Project, but then also just normal schooling. Children go to school in South Africa from 8 till 2. The difficulty is in the afternoon. That's why we have so many after school centers, and that's why wineries get involved also, because we want to keep the children safe off the roads, and also make sure that we have teachers to help them with their schooling so that they can excel. And then there's a whole lot of bursaries. Advini South Africa also have bursaries, fair trade with Arniston Bay. We have put almost 50 to 80 children through university now. And I can tell you, since 2008, we have maybe 6 vineyard workers, children that graduated. None of them are going into the wine industry. They will be doctors, they will be lawyers, they will be other things, and that's wonderful. And but also what makes me also proud is I also see some young women and the children of some of our winery workers that's been on a estate for more than 35 years that actually rediscover the industry. And that's why this hands-on garden that we created was so important, because the parents could actually teach their children the skill of how to prune and how to work in the vineyard, so they could see, wow, my mom and dad, they actually have a skill, and wow, I see that they do important work, and that creates the love for the wine industry, and that's how we bring about change. But yes, certainly must not be, there is no such thing as being locked in. anymore. We have all the opportunity. Not everyone has the funding, but that's why there's a lot of, and that's why the work of Pebbles Project is so important, because if the parents don't have the funding, then there's always other solutions. But of course, it's not that easy. It's not that simple. But I see a lot of beautiful success stories, but of course there are still a lot of people that are suffering, and it's not going to get easier in South Africa, especially with the impact and what we've seen with COVID. So the problem is much deeper. The problem is that we need as a country to put safety nets in place for all industries, not only the wine industry, but because we see how fragile we are, and you lose your job within 24 hours in South Africa, and you have no net to save you. So this is a reality, and I see very similar also in the States. I understand, but I think that the States and Canada are countries that can pick themselves. I mean, you can suffer, but maybe a lot, but you can pick yourself up quicker. Well, that's my vision of it. Maybe I'm wrong, but in the South African and the African context, the economy was already so fragile before that we've actually lost a lot of wonderful progress that we've made. And that's a reality that we need to face. And we must try now, I want to say, make up and recover the best possible way. But yes, opportunities, they are there, and opportunities for everyone. It is the case, maybe for some, and I'm going to say some Black people more than other Black people. It's not even a white or Black thing. It depends on where you are in South Africa, what your contexts are, and what your safety net around yourself is. I mean, in Stellenbosch, it's very, very involved, and as they've come a long way, so they've put in a lot of things in place. So and then there are certain other regions, maybe in the South African wine industry, that still has some work to be done. So we're not all on the same level, but we all have the same goal, and this goal. And that's also what Charlene was saying, is baby steps, but just have a goal, a common goal that everyone can work towards. And of course, the attitude. If the attitude is there and we think differently, and I love how you speak about change management, and sometimes the paradigm always comes from the outside, and that's why it's so stimulating for me also to listen to what these wonderful ladies are saying. But yes, it's not perfect. But there's been a lot of progress, and we're moving in the right direction. And at the end of the day, I think that's the most important, is the goal and the direction, and to bring about change. And again, that change will come through education and through the young.
Thank you so much. I am just going to point out one thing that I found really wonderful to see is we're starting to see some stories of families who come from vineyard workers and have worked vineyards for a while, now making the transition over to producing and having their own wineries. There's one based in California, and I'm completely forgetting, but there's also Guillen Family Wines that's based in Willamette Valley, which is a really wonderful story. And the winemaker, Jesus Guillen, his story is covered a bit in one of Andre Mack's documentaries. It's a shorter one called Red, White, and Black, All Colors of Oregon Wine. And I highly encourage everyone to go check that out, because I think having some of these success stories helps make helps you hold the goal, and it helps make all the work that has to happen to get us there as an industry. That's just the kind of thing that keeps you thriving, right? When you can see those success stories. And I think that's valuable both for BIPOC individuals looking at what their options are and seeing that you really can do this, as well as for allies who are looking to support change. We do have one final question that came through the Q&A. I'll point this one to you, Emily. How do we change the dynamic and have more diverse and more women at high-end restaurants?
Well, this is a key thing. It's a lot of that has to do with kind of like removing that glass ceiling and giving women an opportunity to really grow professionally. And I think that it's also about women raising their hand. I think there's a lot of times when you see men who are not necessarily qualified for jobs, and it doesn't stop them from applying for them. And so when just because you have a job available doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to automatically have the women applying for it that you want. That being said, I think it's also important to have a lot of professional mentorship from women to other women, not just from men to women. And, it's one of the things that we've been doing in my company is, we see people as they develop professionally. Like our restaurants are very diverse, but then as you start to look at the top, it becomes more and more and more white. And what we realized was that the people that were kind of moving up in the industry were those who raised their hands for advancement, and those sort of the tall poppies that stood out. And as we encourage our managers to grow managers from within the restaurants, we found that it's more important to also put in not quotas, but some incentives for them to also develop women and people of color, so that people can start to see themselves being represented at the top in those restaurants and within the profession.
Can I add to that great response? I think that yes, it is true. Like it's if you want, that's again part of that setting that goal. So we want to have more female representation. And I also think it's, I don't know the demographics of who's on this call, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that, in terms of who has the power to make that change, and quite frankly, in my opinion, who has the responsibility to make that change, it may not be people like me. I don't know how many Black women are, I haven't heard of a Black female Danny Myers, for example, right? And so in your work, it is important to, I think, engage the white men in this predominantly white male industry, and let them know that there are people here to support and encourage their initiatives. And also, I don't think it's unfair to say these are the changes that we need. I think people get uncomfortable. I think talking about quotas is a difficult conversation, but I also think when I say it's time to set a goal, some of that goal setting may be numbers, right? I know I've worked with a large national home goods retailer, and they actually do attach, they are at the level where they attach their incentives in terms of their bonus structures to some of their equity and diversity goals that they have in their company. And so all of these things are possible. And the last thing I would say, again, I always say it's not about reinventing the wheel. And I think my little phrases are kind of phrases that make me seem like the work that I do isn't necessary. But where you can look to inspiration for how to diversify your pipeline, especially in terms of women. In the Canadian context, I think Canadian banks have done really well. Lean In and McKinsey put out a report of women at work every year. I think it's important to kind of, there's a lot of people doing this work. And I think it's important to look outside the industry at both successes and failures when you're putting together those plans or initiatives for your company to see what works. I don't think anyone has a monopoly on a bad idea, and I certainly don't think anyone has a monopoly on a good idea.
If I may, there's also one thing that, sorry, Nabilha, that we didn't really touch on it, but it's brand perception also. I mean, how do you better the lives of the people that work in your industry, the whole chain, if you cannot manage to change brand perception and to work the value of your product? I mean, if I look at what South African wines are sold at, and what the consumer perception is of at what price a South African wine must be bought, then I will tell you that is our biggest challenge. Is how do we change? How do we do the valorisation? How do we value the product that these hands work on? And that's the biggest problem. If we cannot change the value, perceived value of the South African wine in the world, we will never be able to plow into our work and the farming community and the whole chain and actually value them. There's a certain price that you need to pay. We can make all the efforts that we can out of a South African and a production point of view. But if it doesn't follow on the other side and people are not willing to pay the value for that work, then we have a big problem. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we face, is that how do you bring your living wage or your minimum wage or your conditions? How do you better that? How are you more equal? How do you give more opportunity if you cannot sell your product at its just value? And so that for me is the key challenge, maybe not only for South African wine industry, but especially for the South African wine industry, because the expectation is very high and the expectation is there to bring about change. but the consumer is not necessarily willing to help us bring that change. And that's something that we have to work on, perceived value and brand perception. Brand South Africa, brand South Africa, never mind wine industry, but brand South Africa, people's vision of this country. So yes, sorry, I just
No, it's quite fine.
That's such an amazing point, because after the the uprising this summer, what we saw on social media was brands. So we're talking about branding. We saw brands. We saw everything from media, tech, banking. Everybody come out and make a statement. And then the response, and sometimes that response was a backlash, was people publicly voicing, specifically Black people publicly voicing what it really meant to have that daily experience of working with that brand. The important thing about the wine industry is the brand is bigger than the actual winemaker. The brand is the region, is the country. And so it is a strong incentive to do this work. As I said, we're in a time where everybody is reimagining their workplaces. It is a strong incentive to do this work, knowing really the value of what's really on the table. And it goes beyond you as an individual winemaker, which I think that there's so much opportunity for collaboration here. The brand is, what do we think of when we think of South African wines, right? What did we think of when we thought about South Africa maybe 30, 35 years ago? Right? It's totally done a 180. What do we think of when we think of Canadian wine? And so, these are conversations that are happening publicly. And I totally agree with Naritha that part of the urgency to be able to begin to do this work, advocacy or change management work within our own companies, within the wine and food industry, is, especially as we're fighting to preserve this industry as the world is changing around us, is the reputational interest, right? I think people are hungry for companies that are doing good and having sustainable practices with, decent protection of workers at the center. So very good point, Naritha. I'm glad you raised it.
Thank you. I definitely think that echoes even some of what Emily had mentioned earlier with the challenge around marking up to actual real costs, or what dish, like what your plate needs to cost or your bottle of wine cost. I only wanted to bring up Emily's discussion of the One Fair Wage report, just because at least in a Canadian context, there isn't a ton of hardcore research, but in the US there is, and some of it is extremely thorough and really speaks to how that answering that question of how we can get more diversity and how we can get more women working in high-end fine dining restaurants where the opportunity for better wages and the salary potential is much higher. So I encourage everyone to go looking for the One Fair Wage report, as well as Restaurant Opportunities Center has drafted 2 working papers, one based out of Seattle and one out of California. Anyone can feel free to connect with me or Emily. Both of us have access to those documents and can help connect people with those resources. That is us. Thank you so much. This has been such a vibrant conversation. Again, for Charlene and Emily and Naritha, thank you so much for joining us and giving your time and all of your knowledge. To everyone who's attended, thank you for joining us. Do know that you can keep that conversation going online and engage with us on our social media tags, which I think we'll get back up there in a moment. But if not, certainly on the Femmes du Vin Instagram as a start. And I think that's a wrap.